Chapter 1. The Summons. At least try to look like you belong in the same building as your betters. The words cut through the morning air like a blade, each syllable designed to remind Lyra of her place. She didn't flinch, hadn't flinched in years. Her calloused hands never paused in their steady rhythm against the marble steps of the grand staircase, the scrub brush wearing smooth grooves into stone that had seen centuries of palace life. Head housekeeper Meredith's voice carried the particular kind of cruelty that came from wielding small power over someone with none. Lyra kept her eyes fixed on the sudsy water pooling in the carved grooves of each step, watching it run pink with the effort of her raw knuckles. The ache in her knees had become as familiar as breathing, a constant companion during the long hours spent making the palace pristine for people who would never see her as more than a moving shadow. "The mating ceremony is only 3 days away," Meredith continued, her voice drifting down from where she supervised with practiced disdain. "Every surface in this palace needs to gleam. The Alpha King's intended arrives tomorrow, and I won't have some nobody servant girl's half-hearted work reflecting poorly on this household. Mating ceremony." The words sent an unwelcome flutter through Lyra's chest, quickly suppressed. She'd been hearing whispers about it for weeks now, servants clustered in corners speaking in hushed voices about Lady Seraphina of the Moonstone Pack, about political alliances and treaties that would reshape the kingdom, about how beautiful the intended was, how perfectly suited to stand beside the Alpha King, everything Lyra was not. "Did you hear me, girl?" "Yes, ma'am." Lyra's voice came out steady, practiced in the art of sounding appropriately submissive. She'd learned long ago that the safest response was always agreement, always compliance. Make yourself smaller, take up less space, blend into the shadows until even your breathing becomes unnoticeable. It was a survival skill she'd perfected over the 15 years since she'd first arrived at the palace. The memory surfaced unbidden. A 7-year-old girl with tangled hair and clothes that hung loose on her small frame, standing in this very entrance hall while adults spoke over her head about charity cases and extra mouths to feed. No family, no pack, no one to claim her or explain where she'd come from, just a child found wandering the forest borders with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The palace had taken her in because that's what the royal household did. Showed mercy to the lost and forgotten. But mercy, Lyra had learned, came with a price. It came with the understanding that gratitude meant silence, that charity meant accepting your place at the very bottom of the hierarchy and never ever reaching for more. She scrubbed harder, forcing the memories back into the dark corners of her mind where they belonged. The past didn't matter, only the work mattered, only staying invisible mattered. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the entrance hall, heavy boots against polished marble that spoke of authority and purpose. Lyra automatically shifted to make herself smaller against the stairs, a practiced movement that had saved her from countless collisions with important people who never looked where they were going. Lyra of the palace staff? Her name spoken in an official tone froze the blood in her veins. The scrub brush slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the marble with a sound that seemed to echo forever. She looked up for the first time in the conversation, finding herself staring at a palace guard she didn't recognize. His face was stern, weathered, with the kind of scars that spoke of real battles rather than ceremonial duties. Most importantly, he was looking directly at her, not through her, not around her, but at her, like she was a person worth acknowledging. It was more terrifying than Meredith's casual cruelty. "Yes?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "You're summoned to the throne room, immediately." The world tilted sideways, summoned, to the throne room. Words that had never been spoken to her, never would be spoken to her, because people like her didn't get summoned. They cleaned up after the people who got summoned, emptied their wastebaskets and scrubbed their floors and pretended not to exist. "There must be some mistake," Meredith said, her voice sharp with the authority she wielded over the serving staff. This girl is assigned to cleaning duties. She has no business in the throne room." The guard's expression didn't change. No mistake. The Alpha King requests her presence. Alpha King. The Alpha King wanted to see her. Lyra's mind went completely blank, a ringing silence that drowned out everything else. What had she done wrong? What rule had she broken without realizing it? The cleaning hadn't been finished to standard. She'd been seen when she should have been invisible. She'd accidentally made eye contact with someone important. Her hands were shaking. When had they started shaking? "I don't," she began, but the guard was already turning away. "Follow me." It wasn't a request. Lyra rose on unsteady legs, her knees protesting after hours spent kneeling on marble. The bucket of soapy water sat abandoned beside the half-cleaned stairs, evidence of her failure to complete assigned duties. Meredith would dock her pay for that, add extra duties as punishment. If she survived whatever was waiting in the throne room to worry about such things. The walk through the palace corridors felt like walking to her own execution. Lyra had cleaned these hallways thousands of times, but she'd never seen them from this perspective, not as spaces to be maintained, but as a path to somewhere she was meant to go. The realization was disorienting, like discovering a familiar room had doors you'd never noticed. Other servants stopped to stare as they passed. She could feel their curious gazes, hear the whispered speculation that would follow in their wake. Lyra, the invisible girl, being escorted to see the Alpha King. It would be the talk of the servant quarters for weeks, assuming she lived to be talked about. Her bare feet made no sound against the marble floors, another skill learned through necessity. Important people didn't like to be reminded that servants existed, so servants learned to move like ghosts. But now the silence felt ominous, like she was already fading away before she'd even faced whatever judgment awaited her. The throne room doors loomed ahead, carved from ancient oak and reinforced with iron bands that had been forged when the palace was first built. Lyra had polished those doors countless times, but she'd never seen them from this side. Never imagined she'd be the one walking through them. The guard paused with his hand on the massive handle, turning to look at her with something that might have been sympathy. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "remember that you belong here as much as anyone." Before Lyra could process the strange kindness in his words, he was pushing open the doors, and the throne room was opening before her, like the mouth of some great beast. The scent hit her immediately, something wild and primal that made her knees weak and set every nerve ending in her body on fire. Pine and leather, and something indefinably masculine that called to parts of herself she'd spent years suppressing. The scent of power, of dominance, of something that recognized her in ways she didn't understand and couldn't possibly deserve. The scent of the Alpha King. And with that recognition came the terrifying certainty that her life, whatever small, invisible thing it had been, was about to change forever. Chapter 10. The Wedding Day Confrontation. The great cathedral had been transformed into a vision of political perfection. White silk banners hung from ancient stone pillars, their surfaces embroidered with the intertwined symbols of the Alpha King's house and the Moonstone Pack. Thousands of white roses filled the air with their sweet fragrance, masking the scent of nervous sweat and barely contained ambition from the assembled guests who represented every major political alliance in the known world. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a statement of power, a display of unity that would reshape the political landscape and secure peace through carefully negotiated bonds of marriage and mutual interest. The cathedral was packed with nobles, dignitaries and representatives from allied territories, all dressed in their finest clothing and most diplomatic smiles. At the altar, Alpha King Kieran stood in ceremonial robes that emphasized both his authority and the solemnity of the occasion. The ancient crown of his bloodline rested on his dark hair, its silver and sapphires catching the morning light that streamed through stained glass windows. But even from her position hidden among the servants at the back of the cathedral, Lyra could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched as he waited for his bride to appear. The mate bond carried his emotions to her across the crowded space, duty warring with instinct, political necessity fighting against every fibre of his being that screamed this was wrong. He could sense her presence in the cathedral, she realised, could feel through their connection that she had returned from her attempted flight, though he couldn't know why or what she had discovered in the forest. Lady Seraphina appeared at the cathedral entrance like a vision of bridal perfection. Her gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and ancient lace, probably worth more than most people earned in several lifetimes. Her golden hair was arranged beneath a delicate crown of diamonds and pearls, and her face glowed with the kind of radiant happiness expected from a woman about to marry the most powerful man in the kingdom. But Lyra could see what others missed. The calculation behind cornflower blue eyes, the way Seraphina's gaze swept the assembled guests like a general surveying a battlefield, the subtle tension in her posture that spoke of someone executing a complex plan rather than celebrating the happiest day of her life. The processional music began, a haunting melody that had been played at royal weddings for centuries. Seraphina glided down the aisle with perfect grace, acknowledging the admiring murmurs of assembled nobles while maintaining the appropriate expression of modest joy. Behind her came her wedding party, ladies from the Moonstone Pack, whose beauty and elegance reinforced the political message that this marriage represented the best of both territories united in harmony. But Lyra's enhanced senses detected something others would miss: the scent of steel hidden beneath silk, the subtle bulges of concealed weapons, the way these supposed ladies moved with the fluid grace of trained fighters rather than pampered nobility. This wasn't just a wedding party, it was an assault team, positioned to strike when the ceremony reached its climax and every important political figure in the kingdom would be trapped in a single location. The officiant began the ancient words that would bind two lives in sacred union. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the joining of Alpha King Kieran and Lady Seraphina of the Moonstone Pack, a union blessed by the moon goddess and designed to bring peace and prosperity to our lands. Each word felt like a physical blow to Lyra, transmitted through the mate bond that screamed against what was happening. She could feel Kieran's struggle, the way every instinct he possessed rebelled against speaking vows to a woman who wasn't his destined mate. But political duty demanded he continue, and so he did. Do you, Kieran, take Seraphina as your mate, your queen, your eternal companion, to honour and protect for as long as you both shall live? The pause that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like eternity. Through the mate bond, Lyra felt Kieran's internal war, duty versus instinct, political necessity versus the pull of destiny that demanded he choose differently. Kieran began, then stopped. Something was wrong. Something beyond the natural reluctance of a man being forced to marry someone other than his true mate. His enhanced senses had detected what Lyra's had already identified: the scent of concealed weapons, the barely contained tension of people preparing for violence, the subtle positioning of Seraphina's wedding party that would allow them to control key exits once bloodshed began. This wasn't a wedding. It was a trap. Stop this ceremony. Lyra's voice cut through the sacred space like a blade, carrying authority that made every person in the cathedral turn toward the sound. She stepped forward from among the servants, no longer attempting to hide or make herself invisible. Royal bloodline power radiated from her like heat, impossible to ignore or dismiss. It's built on lies and blood. The collective gasp from assembled guests was audible, a sharp intake of breath from hundreds of people simultaneously realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. A servant girl, interrupting a royal wedding, speaking with the kind of authority that belonged only to those born to rule. But Lyra was no longer hiding what she was. "Seize her!" Seraphina's command cracked like a whip, her mask of bridal joy dropping to reveal the cold fury beneath. "Kill the servant who dares disrupt sacred ceremony." The wedding party moved with military precision, drawing concealed blades from beneath silk skirts and approaching Lyra with lethal intent. But they had underestimated what they were facing. Royal bloodline magic flowed through her like liquid fire, granting speed and strength that made her dangerous to trained soldiers, let alone assassins who expected to face a helpless servant girl. She moved faster than human eyes could follow, avoiding their strikes and delivering blows that sent attackers flying across ancient stone floors. The enhanced combat abilities that had been awakening over recent days were now fully manifested, turning her into a force of nature that carved through enemy forces with supernatural grace. The assassination attempts, the enemy infiltrations, the convenient intelligence that allowed attackers to find me, it was all orchestrated by your intended bride, Lyra called out to Kieran as she fought, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos erupting around them. "She's been working with Northern Pack leaders to destabilize your rule." She reached into her clothing and withdrew the documents she'd taken from the dead hunters, holding them high enough for the assembled court to see. "Written orders in her own hand, planning your death and the conquest of your kingdom. This marriage was designed to position her for a coup that would destroy everything you've built." Understanding dawned in Kieran's pale green eyes. The pieces that had been troubling him for weeks suddenly fell into place. The timing of attacks that always seemed to target Lyra specifically. The way Seraphina always knew more than she should about threats against the palace. The political pressure that had escalated just as his mate Bond was discovered. He'd been played, manipulated by someone who had never intended to honour wedding vows, who had seen his sense of duty as a weakness to be exploited. His wolf responded with protective fury that shook the ancient cathedral. "Guards!" His voice carried absolute authority, the command of an Alpha King who would not be deceived or manipulated. "Arrest Lady Seraphina and her accomplices for treason." But Seraphina was already moving, her own supernatural speed carrying her toward one of the cathedral's side exits. She paused only long enough to snarl over her shoulder at Lyra, her beautiful face twisted with hatred. "You have no idea what you've cost yourself, little nobody. I know exactly what you are, and when the Northern Packs come for this kingdom, they'll make sure you die slowly enough to regret interfering with plans greater than your servant mind could comprehend." Then she was gone, disappearing through passages she'd obviously scouted in advance, leaving behind chaos and the bitter scent of betrayal that would linger in the sacred space for years to come. The cathedral erupted into confusion as guards pursued fleeing conspirators, nobles demanded explanations, and political alliances shifted like quicksand beneath feet that had thought themselves on solid ground. The wedding that was supposed to secure peace had instead exposed a conspiracy that threatened the stability of the entire kingdom. But through it all, Kieran's gaze never left Lyra's face. She stood in the centre of the disrupted ceremony, no longer hiding her power or apologising for her existence. Royal bloodline magic blazed around her like visible light, declaring to anyone with eyes to see that she was exactly what she'd always been meant to be. Not a servant, not a mistake, not an inconvenience to be managed or eliminated. A queen. His queen. The woman destined to stand beside him, not because of political necessity, but because the moon goddess herself had chosen them for each other. The false wedding was over, but their true story was just beginning. Chapter 11. Trial by Combat. The ancient arena had been built for moments like this, trials that would determine the fate of kingdoms, challenges that separated truth from deception through the most primal test known to their kind. Carved into the living rock beneath the palace centuries ago, its circular floor was stained with the blood of champions and pretenders who had fought to prove their worth before the assembled power of the realm. Now it would host a battle that would reshape everything. Word of the challenge had spread through the kingdom like wildfire. Lady Seraphina, captured during her attempted escape by guards who had been tracking her movements since the conspiracy was exposed, had demanded her right to trial by combat rather than face execution for treason. It was an ancient law, one that couldn't be denied even to accused traitors, and one that would allow her to face her accuser in single combat to let the moon goddess decide who spoke the truth. The arena was packed beyond capacity. Every noble family, every political alliance, every person with sufficient status to witness royal justice had crowded into the stone galleries that overlooked the fighting floor. The air hummed with tension and speculation, voices carrying questions that would soon be answered in blood. At the centre of it all, Lyra stood in clothes she had chosen for practicality rather than ceremony. Simple leather pants and a fitted tunic that would allow unrestricted movement, her dark hair braided back to keep it from interfering with her vision. The pendant that had belonged to her mother hung visible against her chest, its silver surface gleaming with the kind of light that spoke of royal bloodline magic fully awakened. She looked like what she was, a warrior queen prepared to defend her mate and her kingdom through personal combat. Across the arena floor, Lady Seraphina waited in full ceremonial armour that had been crafted by master smiths and enchanted for maximum protection. Every piece gleamed like liquid silver, from the breastplate that bore the symbols of the Moonstone Pack to the helmet that framed her golden hair with metallic perfection. She carried weapons that spoke of wealth and privilege, a sword forged from rare metals, a shield inscribed with protective runes, armour that could turn aside strikes that would kill a lesser fighter. She looked like everything a noble warrior should be, beautiful, dangerous, equipped with the finest tools that money and status could provide. But appearances, as the assembled court had learned, could be deceiving. Elder Thorne stepped forward to announce the terms of combat, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's perfect acoustics. By ancient law and sacred tradition, trial by combat shall determine truth where words have failed. Lady Seraphina of the Moonstone Pack stands accused of treason, conspiracy, and attempted regicide. Lyra of the Silver Moon bloodline brings these charges and offers to prove them through trial by combat. The formal recognition of her heritage sent murmurs through the assembled crowd. Silvermoon, a name that had been thought extinct, spoken now in connection with the servant girl who had disrupted a royal wedding and exposed a conspiracy that threatened the stability of the kingdom. "The terms are thus," Elder Thorne continued, "combat to yield or death, with the victor's truth accepted as absolute. The moon goddess shall judge between them, and her will shall be final." Seraphina raised her sword in salute, the gesture perfectly executed, with the kind of form that spoke of years of training with the finest masters. "I accept these terms," she called out, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight that mattered. "And I look forward to demonstrating what happens to servants who forget their place." Lyra drew the simple steel blade she had taken from a fallen enemy, its weight familiar in her hands, despite its lack of ornamentation or magical enhancement. "I accept these terms," she replied, her voice steady with the kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly what she was fighting for. "And I will show this court what happens to traitors who threaten my mate and my kingdom." The signal to begin came from Elder Thorne's raised hand, falling like a blade through the charged air. Seraphina attacked immediately, her enhanced armour allowing her to move with supernatural speed, while her enchanted weapons sought gaps in defences that should have been impossible for mortal reflexes to counter. She fought like someone accustomed to winning through superior equipment and training, her techniques polished to perfection through years of practice against opponents who could never match her resources. But Lyra was no longer the untrained servant girl who had first picked up a sword only days ago. Royal bloodline magic sang in her veins as she met Seraphina's assault with movements that flowed like water around stone. Every strike was deflected, every thrust turned aside, every combination countered with precision that spoke of ancestral knowledge awakened by necessity and tempered by desperate love. She was faster than she had any right to be, stronger than her build suggested, more skilled than someone with her limited training should have been able to manage. Royal blood carried the accumulated wisdom of generations of warrior queens, and that knowledge guided her blade with supernatural grace. But Seraphina was a formidable opponent, experienced in real combat and equipped with weapons that multiplied her natural abilities. The battle that followed was brutal and beautiful, a dance of death that showcased the difference between learned technique and instinctive mastery. "You cannot win!" Seraphina snarled during a brief pause as they circled each other like predators. "I have trained since childhood to fight opponents like you. I have weapons forged by masters, armor blessed by priests, skills honed through years of preparation. You are nothing but a servant girl with delusions of adequacy." "You're right," Lyra replied, her breathing steady despite the intensity of combat. "You have trained since childhood, studied under masters, equipped yourself with the finest weapons money can buy, but you have one fatal flaw." Seraphina's eyes narrowed behind her helmet. "And what might that be?" "You've never fought someone who had more to lose than you do." The mate bond pulsed between Lyra and Kieran, carrying his strength and support across the arena floor. She could feel his wolf howling encouragement, could sense his absolute faith in her ability to emerge victorious from combat that would determine both their fates. She wasn't just fighting for herself or even for justice. She was fighting for the future they could build together, for the kingdom they could protect as partners, for the love that transcended every social barrier and political obstacle that had tried to keep them apart. That kind of motivation made her dangerous in ways that no amount of training could replicate. The next exchange was decisive. Seraphina committed to a complex attack pattern that should have overwhelmed any opponent, her enchanted blade seeking a killing stroke that would end the fight and prove her innocence through superior skill. But Lyra was no longer thinking like someone who fought to win. She was thinking like someone who fought to protect everything she loved, and that shift in perspective changed everything. She moved through Seraphina's guard like smoke through fingers, her blade finding the one gap in otherwise perfect armor with precision, guided by supernatural instinct. Not a killing blow. She had promised herself that mercy would differentiate her from the woman she faced, but a strike that ended the fight as definitively as death. Seraphina's sword clattered to the arena floor as she fell to her knees, royal bloodline magic having found the pressure point that paralyzed without killing, that demonstrated victory without requiring the ultimate price. "Yield!" Lyra commanded, her blade held steady at Seraphina's throat. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the arena held their breath as they waited for words that would reshape the political landscape and confirm truths that had been spoken in accusations but proven through combat. "I yield," Seraphina whispered, the words torn from her throat like physical pain. The roar that erupted from the assembled crowd shook the ancient arena to its foundations. Justice had been served, truth had been proven, and the conspiracy that had threatened the kingdom had been exposed and defeated through the most basic form of divine judgment their culture recognized. But Lyra barely heard the celebration. Her attention was focused entirely on the pale green eyes watching her from the royal viewing box, on the mate bond that blazed with pride and love and recognition of what she had accomplished. She had proven her worth not just as a fighter, but as someone worthy to stand beside the Alpha King as his equal. Not because of political convenience or social expectation, but because she had been willing to risk everything to protect what they both held dear. The trial was over, the truth had been established, and now, finally, they could begin building the future that had always been their destiny. Chapter 12. The True Mating. The arena fell silent as Kieran descended from the royal viewing box, his ceremonial crown catching the torchlight as he moved with the kind of purpose that made every person in the ancient space understand they were witnessing history being made. The political marriage that would have bound him to a traitor was over. The conspiracy that had threatened his kingdom was exposed, and now, finally, he could claim the mate the moon goddess had chosen for him. Lyra stood in the centre of the blood-stained arena floor, still holding the blade that had proven her truth through combat, her chest rising and falling with the aftermath of battle. Royal bloodline magic still crackled around her like visible heat, but now it carried warmth instead of violence, the power of protection rather than destruction. When Kieran reached her, the mate bond flared between them with an intensity that made the air itself seem to shimmer. Every person in the arena could feel it, that pull of destiny that had been denied for too long, the recognition that transcended politics and social barriers and everything else that had tried to keep them apart. "You are my mate," Kieran said, his voice carrying clearly through the stone space, declaring truth that could no longer be hidden or denied. "And I am yours." The words were simple, ancient, carrying the weight of sacred law that superseded every human convention. In the eyes of their people, in the judgment of the moon goddess herself, nothing else mattered beyond the bond that blazed between them like starfire. Lyra let her weapon fall to the arena floor, the sound of steel against stone, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "I am yours," she replied, her voice steady with the certainty of someone who had finally stopped running from her destiny. "And you are mine." Elder Thorn appeared as if summoned by the moment itself, carrying items that gleamed with the kind of light that spoke of objects touched by divine power. The ancient mating ceremony, unchanged since the kingdom's founding, ready to bind two souls who had fought through political intrigue and assassination attempts and their own fears to find each other. But first came the crown. It had been hidden for 23 years, secreted away after the Silver Moon massacre and protected by those who believed the bloodline might one day return. Silver and moonstone, crafted by artisans whose skills had been lost to time, designed to rest only on the head of someone carrying royal silver moon blood. The moment it touched Lyra's dark hair, it blazed with light that filled the entire arena. Not harsh or blinding, but warm and welcoming. The kind of illumination that spoke of power used to protect rather than dominate. Every person present could see the truth written in that divine glow. She was exactly what she claimed to be, royal blood awakened and ready to rule. "By the ancient laws of our people," Elder Thorn proclaimed, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony that had bound countless generations, "I present Lyra of the Silver Moon bloodline, rightful queen by blood and by combat, mate to Alpha King Kieran by the will of the moon goddess herself." The responding cheer shook dust from stones that had stood for centuries, a sound of pure joy from people who had witnessed their king claim his true mate after the political necessity that would have destroyed him. This wasn't just about personal happiness. It was about the stability that came from a ruler who was complete, supported by the partner destiny had chosen for him. The mating ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. Ancient words spoken by voices that carried love deeper than political alliance, vows that promised partnership in all things, the ritual exchange of blood that would bind their souls until death and beyond. When it was complete, golden light enveloped them both. The mate bond made manifest, visible proof of a connection that transcended mortality itself. As queen, Lyra's first act was one of mercy rather than vengeance. Lady Seraphina, defeated in combat and stripped of her pretensions to noble status, faced exile rather than execution. It would have been easy to demand death for someone who had orchestrated multiple assassination attempts, but true royalty was measured in restraint as much as power. "Let her serve as a warning to others who would threaten this kingdom through deception," Lyra declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to rule. But let it also serve as proof that we are strong enough to show mercy even to our enemies. 6 months later, Lyra stood on the balcony of what had once seemed an impossibly distant royal suite, looking out over the kingdom that was now as much hers to protect as it was to serve. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills dotted with prosperous villages, forests that teemed with life, boundaries secure and alliances strong. Everything a queen could want to see when she surveyed her realm. The transformation had been remarkable, though not always easy. Learning to rule alongside Kieran had required adjustments from both of them, he accustomed to carrying the weight of kingship alone, and she still sometimes surprised to discover that her opinions carried the weight of royal decree. But they were partners in the truest sense, complementing each other's strengths and supporting each other through the inevitable challenges that came with power. The servant quarters had been converted into housing for refugees from the Northern Territories, where the conspiracy's exposure had led to political upheaval that displaced innocent people who needed sanctuary. It felt right somehow that the space where she had once hidden from her destiny now served to help others find safety and new beginnings. Brooding again? Kieran's voice carried warmth and gentle teasing as he joined her on the balcony, slipping his arms around her from behind in a gesture that still sent heat through her veins, despite months of marriage. Reflecting, she corrected, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. Remembering what it felt like to think I would never deserve to stand here. And now? Now I know that deserving had nothing to do with it. I was always meant to be here, with you, protecting our people. I just had to stop being afraid of who I really was. His lips found the sensitive spot behind her ear that never failed to make her shiver with want. I love who you really are, he murmured against her skin. The fierce warrior queen who saved my kingdom, the compassionate ruler who shows mercy to enemies, the woman who chose to fight for us when it would have been easier to run. She turned in his arms to face him, marvelling as she still did at the way his pale green eyes softened when he looked at her. No longer the terrifying Alpha King whose attention had once paralysed her with fear, but simply Kieran, her mate, her partner, her other half in all the ways that mattered. I have something to tell you, she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet joy that transformed ordinary moments into memories that would last lifetimes. Good news, I hope. The best. She took his hands and placed them on her still flat stomach, watching understanding dawn in his expression like sunrise breaking over the horizon. Our heir will arrive by winter's end. The kiss that followed was everything, celebration and promise, and love so deep it transcended words. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and eyes bright with unshed tears of happiness, Kieran rested his forehead against hers in the gesture that had become their private sanctuary. I love you, he said, the words carrying weight that made them feel like sacred vows. I love you, she replied, meaning it with every fibre of her being. Outside their private moment, the kingdom continued its peaceful business. Merchants trading in prosperous markets, children playing in safe streets, farmers tending crops that would feed their people through another secure winter. A realm protected by rulers who had found each other against impossible odds and chosen love over political convenience. The invisible servant girl was gone forever, replaced by a queen who understood the value of both power and compassion. The lonely king had found his perfect partner, someone who saw him as Kieran first and Alpha second, and their people, all their people, from the highest nobles to the humblest workers, lived under the protection of leaders whose bond guaranteed stability and whose love proved that some things were worth fighting for. In years to come, bards would sing of the servant who became a queen, of the king who chose love over duty, of the wedding that never was, and the mating that changed everything. Children would grow up hearing stories of Lyra, of the Silver Moon bloodline, who discovered her true identity just in time to save the kingdom she was destined to rule. But those stories, beautiful as they were, could never capture the real magic of what they had built together. A love that had survived political intrigue and assassination attempts. A partnership that had transformed two people into something greater than the sum of their individual strength. A bond that would protect their people for generations to come. They had found each other against impossible odds, fought for their love against every obstacle, and built something beautiful from the ashes of everything that had tried to destroy them. And they lived, as all the best love stories promised, happily ever after. Chapter 2. The impossible recognition. The throne room was a cathedral of power, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to hold centuries of whispered secrets. Lyra had never seen it from this perspective, as someone meant to stand within its sacred space rather than scrub its floors in the pre-dawn darkness when no one important was watching. Ancient tapestries lined the walls, depicting the great battles and alliances that had built the kingdom. The morning light streamed through stained glass windows, casting jewelled patterns across marble floors, so pristine they reflected the assembled court like a mirror. Everything gleamed with the kind of perfection that only came from invisible hands working tirelessly to maintain it. Hands like hers. But now she stood among the people she'd spent her life serving, and the wrongness of it made her skin crawl with anxiety. The scent that had nearly driven her to her knees at the doorway was stronger here, surrounding her like a living thing that whispered promises her mind couldn't comprehend. The court was arranged in perfect hierarchy, nobles in their silk and velvet closest to the throne, advisers and council members in their formal robes creating a second ring of importance, lesser courtiers and attendants filling the remaining space in carefully ordered ranks. Everyone had a place, everyone belonged somewhere in the intricate web of power and influence, everyone except her. At the centre of it all, seated on the ancient throne carved from a single piece of obsidian, was Alpha King Kieran. Lyra had seen him before, of course. Glimpses caught while dusting corridors as he passed with his advisers, brief moments when she pressed herself against walls to avoid being noticed while he conducted the business of ruling. But she'd never truly looked at him. Servants didn't look directly at their betters, and the Alpha King was so far above her station that even accidental eye contact felt like sacrilege. Now she had no choice but to see him. He was younger than she'd realised, perhaps only a few years older than her own 22. His dark hair caught the morning light, and his frame filled the throne with the kind of presence that spoke of absolute authority. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, pale green like winter ice, sharp with intelligence and carrying the weight of decisions that shaped the fate of thousands. Those eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the marble beneath her feet. Standing beside the throne, resplendent in ivory silk that probably cost more than Lyra would see in a lifetime of service, was Lady Seraphina. Everything about her was perfection. Golden hair arranged in elaborate braids, porcelain skin unmarked by labour or worry, a figure that spoke of careful cultivation and abundant leisure. She was everything an Alpha King's mate should be, beautiful, refined, politically advantageous, everything Lyra was not. The silence stretched until it became oppressive, filled only by the sound of Lyra's too rapid breathing and the whispered speculation of courtiers who had never seen a servant summoned to their sacred space. Then Alpha King Kieran's nostrils flared. It was such a small movement that most of the assembled court probably missed it. But Lyra saw the exact moment recognition hit him, saw his entire body go rigid against the carved throne, saw his hands grip the armrests until his knuckles went white, saw something wild and desperate flash across his carefully controlled features. Mate. The word fell into the silence like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled court. It was spoken as barely more than a growl, so quiet that only those closest to the throne could have heard it clearly. But in the sudden, complete stillness that followed, it might as well have been shouted from the palace towers. The collective gasp was audible, a sharp intake of breath from dozens of people simultaneously realizing they were witnessing something impossible, something that violated every natural law of pack hierarchy and social order. Lady Seraphina's face drained of all colour, her perfect composure cracking for just an instant before royal training reasserted itself. But Lyra saw the flash of fury that preceded the careful blankness, the way her delicate hands clenched into fists before smoothing out against her silk skirts. Alpha King Kieran was rising from the throne now, every muscle in his powerful frame tense with barely controlled energy. He moved like a predator suddenly caged, pacing energy with nowhere to go. His pale green eyes never left Lyra's face, and she could see the war being fought behind them. Instinct versus duty, desire versus responsibility, wolf versus man. Deep in her chest, something stirred in response, something that had been sleeping so deeply she'd forgotten it existed. Her wolf, the part of herself she'd learned to suppress so completely that most days she forgot she had one, pressed against the mental barriers that had kept it contained for years. The sensation was terrifying, like discovering you'd been holding your breath your entire life and suddenly being forced to remember how to breathe. Elder Thorne, the king's most trusted adviser, stepped forward with the kind of careful diplomacy that came from decades of navigating royal crises. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice pitched to carry just the right amount of deference and concern. "Surely there's been some mistake. This is merely a palace servant, perhaps the stress of the upcoming ceremony." "There's no mistake." Kieran's voice cut through the elder's careful words like a blade. "I know what I sent. I know what my wolf recognizes." The bond between them was pulling taut now, a golden thread of connection that seemed to run directly from her chest to his. Every breath brought his scent deeper into her lungs, every heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm she could somehow sense in him. It was impossible. It was terrifying. It was everything she'd never allowed herself to dream of, and everything she knew would destroy her. "The mating ceremony is in 2 days," Lady Seraphina said, her voice carrying the kind of steel that comes from absolute certainty in one's own worth. "The alliance with the Moonstone Pack has already been formalized. Hundreds of guests are arriving. You cannot possibly be suggesting—" She didn't finish the sentence. Couldn't finish it, because giving voice to the impossible would make it real. Kieran's internal struggle was written across every line of his body. Lyra could see duty warring with instinct, political necessity fighting against the most basic drive of his wolf nature. His advisers watched with barely concealed panic, no doubt calculating the political ramifications of their king being mated to a nobody servant girl instead of the carefully chosen bride who would secure their kingdom's future. The golden thread between them pulled tighter, and Lyra gasped at the physical sensation of it, like something essential was being stretched to its breaking point, threatening to snap and leave her bleeding from wounds that couldn't be seen. "Everyone out!" Kieran's voice brooked no argument, carrying the absolute authority of a king who had never been denied. "Everyone out, now." "Your Majesty, I really think," Elder Thorne began. "Now." The single word carried enough alpha command to make every person in the room instinctively want to submit. Courtiers began filing out immediately, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of speculation that would spread through the palace like wildfire. Lady Seraphina lingered for a moment, her perfect mask slipping enough to reveal the calculation behind her cornflower blue eyes. "Kieran," she said, using his name with the familiarity of a woman who expected to share his bed and his crown, "don't do anything you'll regret." But even she couldn't ignore a direct command from her Alpha King. With one last look that promised this conversation was far from over, she swept from the throne room in a rustle of silk and barely contained fury. Soon only Lyra and Kieran remained in the vast space, the silence between them heavy with everything that couldn't be said. The mate bond hummed with possibility and heartbreak, a connection that demanded acknowledgement, while circumstances made that acknowledgement impossible. Lyra stood frozen in the centre of the throne room, every instinct screaming at her to run while her wolf pressed desperately against its mental cage, begging to be allowed closer to its mate. She'd spent her entire life learning to make herself invisible, and now she was the only thing the most powerful man in the kingdom could see. The golden thread between them pulsed with each shared heartbeat, a rhythm that spoke of destiny and desire and the kind of love that could reshape kingdoms or destroy them entirely. Chapter 3. The Private Confrontation. The massive throne room doors closed with a sound like thunder, sealing them alone in a space that suddenly felt far too intimate despite its vast size. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rapid rhythm of Lyra's breathing and the whisper of Kieran's boots against marble as he began to pace. She'd never been alone with anyone this important, never stood in the same room as someone who could end her life with a word, reshape the kingdom with a decision, command armies with a gesture. The weight of his presence was overwhelming, made worse by the golden thread of connection that seemed to pulse between them with each shared heartbeat. Kieran moved like a caged wolf, all restless energy with nowhere to go. His hands raked through his dark hair repeatedly, disturbing the carefully arranged style until it fell across his forehead in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. The controlled mask of kingship had slipped, revealing the man beneath the crown. "I don't understand this any more than you do." His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, strained with the effort of maintaining control when everything in his nature demanded he close the distance between them. He stopped his pacing to look at her directly, and Lyra had to fight the urge to drop her gaze to the floor. Servants didn't meet the eyes of their betters. Servants especially didn't meet the eyes of the Alpha King. But the mate bond made such social niceties impossible. It demanded recognition, connection, acknowledgement of what existed between them, regardless of station or circumstance. "Your Majesty," she began, then stopped. "What was the protocol for addressing the man your wolf recognized as mate when you were nothing more than a servant girl who cleaned his floors? I don't know why this is happening. I would never presume to—" "Stop!" The command was gentle but absolute. "Don't apologize for something neither of us can control." The golden thread between them pulsed, and Lyra gasped at the physical sensation of it. Like warmth spreading through her chest, like coming home to a place she'd never been, like finding the missing piece of herself she hadn't known, was lost. The mate bond was supposed to be the most sacred connection in their world, the perfect pairing of souls destined to complete each other. It was also supposed to happen between equals, between people whose union would strengthen pacts and create powerful alliances, not between a king and a nobody servant girl whose very existence was a threat to everything he'd worked to build. "The political reality," Kieran said, his voice heavy with a burden she was only beginning to understand, "is that my marriage to Lady Seraphina isn't just a personal choice, it's a treaty. The Moonstone Pack's alliance is the only thing standing between our kingdom and war with the Northern Territories. Without that marriage, without that bond between our packs, thousands will die." The words hit her like physical blows. Of course it was about more than personal preference, or even royal duty. Kings didn't have the luxury of choosing love over duty, especially not when that choice meant choosing a servant girl over the survival of their people. "Then I'll leave," Lyra said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I can disappear. Go somewhere far away where the bond won't affect you. You'll never have to see me again, never have to be reminded of this mistake." The last word tasted like poison in her mouth, but what else could she call it? A cosmic error, a cruel joke played by fate on two people who had no business being connected. She was nothing, had always been nothing, would always be nothing. The mate bond didn't change that fundamental truth about her place in the world. Kieran's reaction was swift and violent. He was across the throne room in 3 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders with just enough force to keep her from backing away. His pale green eyes blazed with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Do you think I want to feel this way about a servant?" The words were torn from him like they caused physical pain. "Do you think I asked for my wolf to recognize someone who can't possibly be my queen? Someone whose very existence threatens everything I've sworn to protect?" Each word was a dagger to her heart, confirming every terrible truth she'd always known about herself. She was beneath him, unworthy, an inconvenience to be managed, a problem to be solved. The mate bond might make his wolf want her, but the man, the king, saw her for what she really was, nothing. The moment the cruel words left his mouth, Kieran's expression changed. She watched horror and regret flood his features as he realized what he'd just said, how deeply he'd cut her. But the damage was done. The truth had been spoken, and they both knew it couldn't be taken back. Lyra felt something inside herself shut down, a protective mechanism that had kept her sane through 15 years of being nobody's priority. She retreated into the safe space of invisibility, making herself smaller, less threatening, less real. Her shoulders curved inward, her eyes dropped to the marble floor, her entire posture screamed submission and acceptance of her place. "You're right, Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was breaking. "I am just a servant. I never should have presumed that the mate bond meant anything more than a biological mistake. I apologize for the disruption my existence has caused." "Lyra, no, that's not what Kieran started, but she was already pulling away from his touch, already rebuilding the walls that had protected her for so long. His wolf was fighting him now. She could sense it through their connection. The beast in him wanted to comfort his mate, to take back the words that had hurt her, to bridge the gap his human fears had created. But the man, the king, was bound by duties and obligations that made such comfort impossible. "I understand the political necessity," she continued, each word carefully measured and empty of the pain that was tearing her apart inside. "Lady Seraphina is everything a queen should be, beautiful, refined, politically advantageous. The alliance with the Moonstone Pack is more important than the inconvenience of an impossible mate bond." Kieran's hands fell to his sides, clenched into fists as he fought against every instinct demanding he comfort her. The golden thread between them stretched taut with unspoken longing and heartbreak. "I'll make sure you're protected," he said finally, his voice hollow with the weight of duty choosing duty over desire. "Provided for. You'll have a position in the palace, comfortable quarters, everything you need. But this can't—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to the truth they both understood, that they would have to live with this connection, this pull toward each other, while pretending it didn't exist. That she would have to watch him marry another woman while the mate bond burned between them like a constant ache. "I understand, Your Majesty." Lyra's curtsy was perfect, practiced through years of serving people who barely saw her as human. "Thank you for your generosity. I won't trouble you with this matter again." She turned toward the massive doors, each step away from him feeling like walking through fire. The mate bond protested violently, sending waves of anguish through her chest as she increased the physical distance between them. Behind her she could hear Kieran's ragged breathing, could sense through their connection how much effort it was taking him not to call her back. But he didn't call her back. Duty held him silent while she walked away from the only person in the world who had ever been meant for her. Chapter 4. The Rival's Threat. The servant quarters felt smaller than usual when Lyra returned, the narrow corridors and cramped rooms suddenly suffocating after the vast space of the throne room. Every step echoed with whispered conversations that died the moment she appeared, replaced by the kind of fearful silence that followed those who had been marked as dangerous by association. Word travelled fast in the palace, too fast. She could see it in the way other servants pressed themselves against walls to avoid her, in the nervous glances that followed her movement, in the way conversations stopped mid-sentence when she entered a room. They knew something had happened in the throne room. They knew she'd been alone with the Alpha King. They knew she was no longer just another invisible servant girl scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots. She was something else now, something that frightened them. Lyra tried to return to her normal duties, desperate for the mindless routine that had anchored her life for 15 years. She retrieved her cleaning supplies from the storage closet, filled her bucket with soapy water, and made her way back to the grand staircase where she'd been interrupted hours ago. The marble steps were exactly as she'd left them, half clean, abandoned mid-task when her world had been turned upside down. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see Kieran's face when he'd spoken those cruel words. "Do you think I want to feel this way about a servant?" The pain of it sat in her chest like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, impossible to forget. The mate bond pulled constantly now, a golden thread of connection that she couldn't sever no matter how much distance she put between them. She was scrubbing the same step for the third time when the scent hit her. Jasmine and roses, expensive perfume that cost more than Lyra earned in a year. The kind of fragrance that announced its wearer's wealth and status long before she entered a room. Lady Seraphina's signature scent, as carefully cultivated as everything else about the Alpha King's intended mate. Lyra's hands stilled on the scrub brush. In 15 years of living in the palace, she had never seen a member of the nobility in the servant quarters. They existed in entirely different worlds, separated by protocol and social barriers that might as well have been physical walls. For Lady Seraphina to be here, in this cramped corridor that reeked of lye soap and honest sweat, was unprecedented. It was also terrifying. "So you're the little mistake that's disrupting my wedding plans?" The voice was silk and honey, refined in the way that only came from generations of breeding and careful education. But underneath the cultured tones was something sharp enough to cut glass, dangerous enough to draw blood. Lyra looked up to find Lady Seraphina standing at the top of the staircase like a vision from another world. Even in the dim light of the servant quarters, she was breathtakingly beautiful. Her golden hair was arranged in an elaborate style that probably required 2 ladies' maids and an hour of careful work. Her gown was midnight blue silk that complemented her cornflower eyes and emphasized her perfect figure. Everything about her spoke of wealth, power, and the absolute certainty that the world would bend to accommodate her wishes. She was examining the servant quarters with the kind of casual interest someone might show when visiting a foreign country, taking in details that would normally be beneath her notice. The narrow corridors, the rough stone walls, the practical furniture built for durability rather than comfort. Her perfect nose wrinkled slightly at the smell of carbolic soap and the lingering odours of hard labour. "Fascinating," she murmured, descending the stairs with careful grace. "I've never seen how the other half lives. How quaint that they give you actual rooms instead of just pallets in the kitchens." Lyra scrambled to her feet, dropping into the deep curtsy protocol demanded when faced with nobility. Her wet hands left dark stains on her rough servant's dress, evidence of the work that defined her existence. "My lady," she managed, keeping her eyes fixed on the marble floor between them, "I wasn't expecting. That is, if you need something cleaned or prepared." "Oh, I'm not here for cleaning services." Seraphina's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and cold. "I'm here to have a conversation with the little nobody who thinks she can interfere with matters far above her station." The words were delivered with such casual cruelty that they took a moment to register. When they did, Lyra felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was deliberate. "I think there's been some misunderstanding, my lady. I haven't interfered with anything. I would never presume—" "Presume?" Seraphina's eyebrows rose in perfectly practised surprise. "My dear girl, you've done far more than presume. You've managed to disrupt an entire mating ceremony with your very existence. That takes a special kind of audacity." The threat was still wrapped in silk politeness, but Lyra could hear the steel underneath. She risked a glance upward and immediately wished she hadn't. Seraphina's cornflower blue eyes were glacier cold, calculating in a way that spoke of intelligence used as a weapon. Accidents happen to careless servants all the time, Serafina continued, her voice maintaining its conversational tone while delivering words that made Lyra's blood freeze. Falls down staircases, tragic incidents with cleaning chemicals, food poisoning from spoiled meat. The life of a servant is so dangerous, so unpredictable. One can never tell when misfortune might strike. The casual way she delivered the threats made them more terrifying than any shouted ultimatum. This was a woman who was used to getting what she wanted, who had resources Lyra couldn't even imagine, who could make a servant girl disappear without anyone important asking questions. "But I'm not entirely unreasonable," Serafina said, pausing in her examination of a rough wooden chair to smile at Lyra with predatory warmth. "I understand that wolves like you don't just appear from nowhere. Someone with your particular scent signature surely has a more interesting origin story than found wandering in the woods as a child." Lyra's heart stopped. The Alpha King's intended mate knew more about her background than she herself did. How was that possible? "Oh yes, I've done my research," Serafina continued, reading the shock on Lyra's face with satisfaction. "Amazing what you can discover when you have the right resources, the right connections. Palace records can be so illuminating, especially the older ones that most people never bother to examine." She moved closer, and Lyra caught the full force of her perfume. Expensive, cloying, designed to overwhelm and intimidate. Everything about this woman was a weapon, from her beauty to her breeding to her casual cruelty. "When I find out what you really are, little nobody," Serafina said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "When I discover whatever secret brought you to this palace 15 years ago, you'll wish you'd never been born." The promise hung in the air between them, like a blade suspended over Lyra's neck. This wasn't just about protecting a political marriage anymore. This was about something deeper, more dangerous, something that connected to the mysterious circumstances of her arrival as a child, to the gaps in her memory that had never been explained, to the questions about her identity that no one had ever bothered to answer. "I suggest you remember your place," Serafina said, stepping back to examine her perfectly manicured nails. "Servants who forget where they belong have a tendency to meet unfortunate ends, especially servants who threaten the stability of the kingdom with their inconvenient existence." She turned to go, her silk skirts rustling against the rough stone walls of the servant corridor. But at the top of the stairs she paused to deliver one final blow. "Oh, and dear, the wedding is still in 2 days. I do hope you'll be able to attend the ceremony. It would be such a shame if you missed seeing Kieran pledge his eternal devotion to his true mate." Then she was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of jasmine and roses and the echo of threats that promised much worse than death. Lyra stood alone in the narrow corridor, her hands shaking as the full implications of the conversation settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She wasn't just an inconvenient mate bond anymore. She was a mystery to be solved, a threat to be eliminated, a problem that required permanent resolution. And Lady Serafina had the resources, the connections, and the ruthless determination to destroy her completely. The other servants who had witnessed the confrontation scattered like leaves before a storm, suddenly remembering urgent duties that required their immediate attention elsewhere. No one wanted to be associated with someone who had earned the personal enmity of the future queen. Lyra was more alone now than she had ever been in her life. Chapter 5. The Oracle's Revelation. Sleep was impossible. Every time Lyra closed her eyes, she saw Serafina's cold smile and heard the whispered threats that promised a fate worse than death. The mate bond ached in her chest like a physical wound, pulsing with each heartbeat and reminding her of everything she could never have, everything that was forbidden to someone of her station. The servant quarters were silent except for the soft breathing of women who had earned their rest through honest labour. But Lyra lay rigid on her narrow cot, staring at the rough stone ceiling and trying to make sense of the impossible turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she'd been nobody, invisible, safe in her anonymity. Now she was a threat to the stability of the kingdom, marked for elimination by a woman with the power and resources to make her disappear without a trace. The soft knock on her door came just past midnight, so quiet she almost thought she'd imagined it. But then it came again, 3 gentle taps that somehow managed to sound urgent despite their softness. Lyra slipped from her cot and padded barefoot to the door, her heart hammering with fear. Had Seraphina decided not to wait? Were those assassins on the other side come to make her death look like an accident? But when she cracked the door open, she found Elder Thorne standing in the corridor. The sight of him was so unexpected, so completely outside the realm of possibility, that for a moment she wondered if she was dreaming. The Alpha King's most trusted adviser didn't visit servant quarters. He didn't seek out lowly palace staff in the middle of the night. He existed in the rarefied atmosphere of court politics and royal decision-making, as far above her station as the stars were above the earth. "May I come in, child?" His voice was gentle, pitched low to avoid waking the other servants. "We need to talk." Elder Thorne was older than Kieran by perhaps 20 years, his dark hair threaded with silver at the temples, and his face marked with the kind of lines that came from carrying the weight of difficult decisions. But his eyes were kind, shrewd with intelligence, but touched with a warmth that spoke of genuine compassion. In all her years at the palace, she'd never heard him speak cruelly to a servant, or treat anyone with less than basic dignity. Still, his presence here was unprecedented, terrifying. "Elder Thorne," she whispered, dropping into a curtsy despite her bare feet and simple nightgown. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. If I've done something wrong—" "You haven't done anything wrong," he said quietly, glancing down the corridor to ensure they weren't being observed. "But we need to speak privately, may I?" She stepped aside to let him enter, acutely aware of how small and shabby her quarters were compared to the luxury he was accustomed to. A single narrow cot, a wooden chest for her few belongings, a washstand with a cracked mirror. Everything practical, nothing beautiful, nothing that spoke of comfort or personal taste. Elder Thorne examined the sparse room without judgment, his expression thoughtful rather than disdainful. When his eyes met hers again, she saw something there that made her breath catch. Recognition. Not the kind of recognition that came from seeing a servant around the palace, but something deeper. Something that suggested he saw her as more than just another invisible girl who cleaned floors. "You can't sleep," he said, and it wasn't a question. "The bond won't let you rest, and Lady Seraphina's threats have left you wondering if you'll live to see another dawn." The accuracy of his observation was shocking. How could he possibly know about Seraphina's visit to the servant quarters? How could he know about the sleepless nights and the constant ache of the mate bond that was supposed to bring joy, but instead brought only pain? "I don't know what you mean," she lied, falling back on the servant's instinct to deny knowledge of anything that might be inconvenient for her betters. "Child," Elder Thorne said gently, "I've been watching over you since the day you arrived at this palace 15 years ago. I know exactly what Seraphina told you this afternoon, just as I know exactly why your very existence threatens her carefully laid plans." The world tilted sideways. Watching over her? Since the day she arrived? But that implied, that suggested. "You were never meant to be a servant," Elder Thorne continued, his voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets finally being spoken aloud. "You were never supposed to spend your life scrubbing floors and accepting the casual cruelty of people who should have been bowing to you instead." "I don't understand." The words came out as barely a whisper. "I'm nobody. I was found in the woods. A charity case. Everyone knows—" "Everyone knows a lie," Elder Thorne said, moving to sit on the single wooden chair in her small room. "A necessary lie, designed to protect a child whose true identity would have gotten her killed before her 7th birthday." He reached into his robes and withdrew something that gleamed in the dim candlelight, an ancient book bound in leather so old it was nearly black. The cover was embossed with symbols she didn't recognize, but something about them made her wolf stir restlessly. "The Silver Moon Pack," he said, opening the book to reveal pages of carefully illuminated text and detailed genealogical charts. "The most powerful royal bloodline in the known world, blessed by the moon goddess herself with strength, wisdom, and the ability to unite fractured territories under peaceful rule. Silver Moon." The name resonated through her like the tolling of a distant bell, awakening something deep in her memory that had been buried for so long she'd forgotten it existed. "They were destroyed 23 years ago," Elder Thorne continued, his voice heavy with old grief. "Betrayed by those who feared their power, hunted down and slaughtered in a single night of violence that left their territory running red with royal blood." He turned the page, revealing a family portrait painted in exquisite detail, a man and woman of obvious nobility, their bearing regal despite the simple clothes they wore. Between them stood a small girl with dark hair and eyes that seemed familiar, though Lyra couldn't place where she might have seen them before. "Your parents," Elder Thorne said simply, "King Marcus and Queen Eleanor of the Silver Moon bloodline. They escaped the massacre with their infant daughter, but they knew it was only a matter of time before their enemies found them, so they made an impossible choice." He reached across the small space to take her hands, turning them palm up to reveal the thin white scars that crossed her wrists, scars she'd always assumed were from childhood accidents, meaningless marks that held no significance. "Suppression ritual scars," he said gently. "Your parents performed the most powerful concealment magic known to our kind, hiding your scent, your power, even your bloodline memories behind barriers so complete that you yourself believed the story of being found abandoned in the woods." The scars seemed to pulse under his touch, and Lyra felt something shifting deep inside her, like chains that had bound her for so long she'd forgotten they existed, suddenly loosening their grip. "They brought you here under cover of darkness," Elder Thorne continued. "Asked me to watch over you, to keep you safe until the time came for you to reclaim your birthright. They died 3 days later, murdered by assassins who never knew how close they'd come to finding the last heir of the Silver Moon line." "No." The word was torn from her throat, desperate with denial. "No, that's impossible. I would remember. I would know if I had. The suppression ritual was designed to be complete," Elder Thorne said with infinite compassion. "Your parents sacrificed everything, your memories, your power, your knowledge of who you truly are, to keep you alive. But suppression magic was never meant to last forever. It weakens over time, especially when faced with powerful emotional triggers. Like a mate bond, like the recognition of an alpha king whose wolf could sense royal blood even through the strongest concealment spells. The prophecy speaks of a Silver Moon heir who will bond with the alpha king to unite the fractured territories," Elder Thorne said, turning to another page in the ancient book. "A union that will bring peace to lands that have known nothing but war for generations. Your parents died believing that prophecy referred to you, that you were destined for something greater than hiding in shadows and pretending to be less than you are." He closed the book and set it carefully on her washstand, then reached into his robes again to withdraw something that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. A pendant on a silver chain, the metal so bright it seemed to glow with its own inner light. The pendant itself was carved in the shape of a crescent moon, inlaid with stones that captured and reflected the candlelight like trapped starfire. "This was your mother's," he said, holding it out to her. "Hidden with her body until it was safe to retrieve. It will react to royal Silver Moon blood, and to that blood alone." Lyra's hands trembled as she reached for the pendant. The moment her fingers touched the silver, it blazed with sudden light, not harsh or blinding, but warm and welcoming, like coming home after a long journey through darkness. The light seemed to flow through her, awakening parts of herself that had been sleeping for so long she'd forgotten they existed. Power stirred in her chest, not the desperate struggle of her wolf against suppression, but something deeper and more profound, something that spoke of authority earned through generations of wise rule, of strength tempered with compassion, of the kind of power that was given rather than taken. "You have a choice," Elder Thorne said gently. "I can teach you about your heritage, help you understand the power that is awakening within you, help you prepare for what's coming, because the suppression is breaking down whether we guide it or not. Or you can choose to let the barriers crumble naturally, though that path is more dangerous and less controlled." The pendant grew warm against her palm, and for the first time in her life, Lyra felt like she was exactly where she belonged, not hiding in shadows, not apologizing for her existence, not accepting the cruel words of those who saw her as beneath their notice. Royal, powerful, chosen by prophecy and protected by love so fierce her parents had died to keep her safe. "What happens to Kieran?" she asked, because even with this revelation reshaping everything she thought she knew about herself, the mate bond still pulled at her heart. "What happens to the alliance with the Moonstone Pack?" "That," Elder Thorne said with a slight smile, "depends entirely on what you choose to do with the truth." Chapter 6. The first awakening dawn came too soon, and not soon enough. Lyra had spent the remaining hours before sunrise staring at the pendant in her palm, watching the way it caught and held the candlelight like trapped moonbeams. Every time she touched it, warmth spread through her chest, and power stirred in response. Not the desperate clawing of her wolf against suppression, but something deeper and more profound. Royal blood, ancient magic, a destiny she'd never imagined, and parents who died to keep her safe. The revelation should have changed everything, but when morning duties called, she still had floors to scrub and chambers to clean. The other servants still avoided her with fearful glances, still whispered behind their hands when they thought she wasn't listening. Lady Seraphina's threat still hung over her like a blade waiting to fall, but something was different now. Something fundamental had shifted in the way she moved through the world, the way she held herself, the way she responded to the casual cruelties that had defined her existence for 15 years. The pendant hung hidden beneath her rough servant's dress, its warm weight against her heart, a constant reminder that she was more than what others saw. She was attempting to return to the normalcy of morning cleaning duties when it happened. The enhanced hearing came first, so gradually she almost didn't notice. She was scrubbing the floors of the main corridor when she began picking up conversations from rooms that should have been too far away to overhear. At first she dismissed it as her imagination, the after-effects of a sleepless night and world-shattering revelations. But then she heard her name. "Little servant girl has disrupted everything. The Alpha King can barely concentrate on wedding preparations. Dangerous precedent, if servants start thinking they can aspire to mate bonds with royalty." "Seraphina is furious. I've never seen her so coldly angry." The voices were coming from the kitchen, 3 corridors away and down a flight of stairs. There was no possible way she should be able to hear them, yet every word came through with perfect clarity. Her wolf was stirring again, pressing against barriers that suddenly felt less solid, more permeable. The suppression magic was breaking down, just as Elder Thorne had warned. She was still processing this development when she heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Powder dissolved completely. He'll never taste it in the morning tea. "Sure it will work quickly enough. We can't have him suffering. Too much risk of discovery." "Minutes at most. Peaceful," they said, like he simply stopped breathing in his sleep. Poison. They were poisoning someone, and from the context of hushed voices and careful planning, it wasn't meant to be discovered until it was too late. But who? Alpha King always takes his morning meal in the private dining chamber, alone. The scrub brush slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly too quiet corridor. Kieran. They were going to poison Kieran, and from the sound of the conversation, it was happening now, this morning, during his usual private breakfast that no one was allowed to interrupt. Her wolf exploded against the mental barriers that had contained it for so long, fueled by a protective rage so fierce it threatened to tear her apart from the inside. The mate bond, which had been a constant ache of longing and heartbreak, suddenly blazed with desperate urgency. Her mate was in danger, and every instinct she possessed demanded she protect him, regardless of the personal cost. She was running before conscious thought could interfere, her bare feet silent against the marble as she raced through corridors she'd cleaned 1,000 times, but had never navigated with such desperate purpose. Servants scattered from her path, startled by the wild look in her eyes and the way power seemed to crackle around her like visible heat. The suppression barriers were cracking, 15 years of magical concealment fracturing under the stress of mortal terror and protective fury. She could feel abilities she'd never known she possessed stirring to life. Enhanced senses, supernatural speed, strength that had nothing to do with physical conditioning, and everything to do with bloodline power that refused to stay buried. The private dining chamber was on the other side of the palace, through corridors restricted to nobility and their personal attendants. She'd never been allowed in those sections, never had reason to venture beyond the servant areas where people like her belonged, but protocols and social boundaries meant nothing when your mate was about to die. She burst through doors that should have been locked, ignored startled shouts from guards who tried to intercept her path, and arrived at Kieran's private dining chamber just as he was lifting the ornate teacup to his lips. "Don't!" The word tore from her throat as she launched herself across the room, knocking the cup from his hands with a force that sent it flying across the chamber to shatter against the far wall. The liquid splashed across the marble floor, and where it landed, the stone began to hiss and smoke. Acid, not just poison, but something designed to burn through flesh and bone, to destroy evidence while creating maximum suffering. Kieran's reaction was immediate and violent. The Alpha King exploded from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator suddenly threatened, his pale green eyes blazing with protective fury as he assessed what he perceived as an attack from the one person he'd tried to protect. "Guards!" His voice carried absolute authority, the kind of command that could stop armies in their tracks. "Seize her!" The dining chamber doors burst open as armed guards flooded in, weapons drawn and ready to kill the servant girl who had dared to assault their king. But Lyra was no longer thinking like a servant, no longer moving with the careful submission that had kept her safe for so long. Royal blood sang in her veins, awakened by crisis and fueled by the desperate need to make him understand. "The tea!" she gasped, pointing to where the spilled liquid was still eating through marble that had stood for centuries. "Look at what it's doing to the stone." Kieran's gaze followed her gesture, and she watched his expression change as he took in the evidence before him. The smoking floor, the acrid smell of whatever chemical had been dissolved in his morning tea, the realization that she hadn't been attacking him, she'd been saving his life. His wolf recognized the truth before his human mind could process it, responding to the mate who had risked everything to protect him. The bond between them flared with gratitude and something deeper, more primal, recognition of devotion that transcended social boundaries and political obligations. "Stand down!" Kieran commanded his guards, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. "Lower your weapons." But even as the immediate threat receded, Lyra could feel the supernatural energy still crackling through her system. The suppression barriers were fracturing faster now, power leaking through the cracks in ways that were impossible to hide. Her wolf pressed closer to the surface, no longer content to remain buried beneath magical concealment. "How did you know?" Kieran asked, moving around the table to stand before her. Up close, she could see the shock in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he processed how close he'd come to death. "I heard them talking," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "In the kitchen. My hearing. It's changed, enhanced. I could hear conversations from 3 corridors away, and they were planning this. They said it would be quick, that you'd never taste the poison in your tea. Understanding dawned in his pale green eyes. Enhanced senses, supernatural abilities awakening in response to emotional trauma. These weren't normal servant capabilities. These were the signs of powerful bloodline magic breaking free from whatever had contained it. "Who?" he demanded, and there was something dangerous in his voice now, something that promised swift and permanent justice for anyone who had dared threaten his life. "Who planned this?" But before Lyra could answer, the dining chamber doors opened again to admit someone whose very presence made the air crackle with tension. Lady Seraphina entered like a vision of concerned perfection, her golden hair immaculately arranged despite the early hour, her morning gown a masterpiece of silk and lace that probably cost more than most servants earned in a lifetime. Her cornflower blue eyes took in the scene with what appeared to be genuine shock: the shattered teacup, the smoking floor, the armed guards, and Lyra standing far too close to the Alpha King, with power still crackling around her like visible heat. "Kieran?" she gasped, moving toward him with graceful urgency. "I heard shouting. Are you hurt? What happened?" Her performance was flawless. Every word, every gesture, every expression conveyed perfect concern for her intended mate's welfare. If Lyra hadn't heard the kitchen conversation with her own enhanced hearing, she might have believed the act completely, but she could smell the lie now, a sour note beneath the expensive perfume that spoke of deception and hidden satisfaction. Lady Seraphina wasn't surprised by the assassination attempt. She was disappointed that it had failed. "Someone tried to poison me," Kieran said, his voice carefully controlled as he watched both women for their reactions. "If not for Lyra's intervention, I would be dead." Seraphina's gaze flicked to Lyra with what appeared to be surprise, but underneath the perfect mask there was something cold and calculating, something that promised swift and terrible retribution for the servant girl who had dared to interfere with carefully laid plans. "How fortunate that she happened to be nearby," Seraphina said, her voice silk smooth with just the right note of gratitude. "Though I must say it's quite unusual for a servant to possess the kind of enhanced senses that would allow such timely intervention." The words were a trap designed to make Kieran question how a lowly palace servant could possibly have abilities that rivaled those of trained warriors. But they were also an admission of guilt, a subtle acknowledgement that Seraphina knew exactly what kind of supernatural capabilities Lyra was manifesting. The kind that came from royal bloodline magic breaking free from suppression spells. The kind that proved she was exactly what Seraphina had feared she might be. Chapter 7. The Training Begins. "If you're going to be a target, you need to learn how to defend yourself." Kieran's words from the previous evening echoed through Lyra's mind as she made her way to the secluded courtyard just after dawn. The assassination attempt had changed something fundamental between them. Not the mate bond, which had always burned bright and impossible, but the way he looked at her, like she was someone worth protecting rather than a problem to be managed. The courtyard was hidden behind the palace's east wing, surrounded by high stone walls covered in climbing roses that would bloom in a few weeks' time. It had been designed as a private training space for the royal family, complete with weapon racks, practice dummies, and enough room to spar without being observed by curious courtiers or servants who might report back to interested parties. Like Lady Seraphina, whose barely concealed fury at the failed poisoning had been palpable during yesterday's awkward explanations about kitchen staff and security breaches that would be investigated thoroughly. Kieran was already there when she arrived, dressed in plain training leathers that emphasized the powerful build usually hidden beneath royal finery. He moved with the fluid grace of a natural fighter, checking weapons and adjusting practice equipment with the kind of familiarity that spoke of years spent honing skills that were more than ceremonial. "You're late," he said without turning around, though there was no real criticism in his voice. "I had to finish the morning cleaning duties," Lyra replied, then immediately regretted the words. They highlighted the vast gulf between them. He was a king preparing to train his mate in combat. She was a servant who still had floors to scrub before she could attend to matters of life and death. But Kieran's expression softened at the reminder of her divided loyalties and impossible position. After today, someone else can handle your cleaning assignments. Your safety is more important than pristine marble. The casual way he dismissed duties that had defined her entire existence was both thrilling and terrifying. What would she be, if not the invisible servant girl who made the palace gleam? Who was she allowed to become, if not the nobody who accepted cruelty as the natural order of things? "We'll start with basic defensive positions," Kieran said, selecting a practice sword from the weapon rack. The blade was dulled but weighted properly, designed to build muscle memory without causing serious injury during training accidents. "Show me how you would block an overhead strike." Lyra stared at the weapon he offered her, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the leather-wrapped hilt. She'd never held a sword before, had never been allowed near weapons of any kind. Servants weren't trained in combat. They were trained to run, to hide, to submit to whatever violence found them. But the moment her fingers closed around the grip, something shifted. The weight felt familiar in her hands, the balance natural in a way that suggested muscle memory, buried so deep she'd forgotten it existed. Royal bloodline magic stirring to life, carrying knowledge that had been suppressed along with everything else about her true identity. "Like this?" she asked, raising the blade in what felt like the correct defensive position. Kieran's eyebrows rose in surprise. Her stance was nearly perfect. Feet positioned for maximum stability, blade angled to deflect rather than absorb the full force of an attack, body coiled to respond with either retreat or counterattack, depending on the situation. "That's very good for someone who's never held a sword," he said carefully. "Try blocking my strike." He moved slowly, telegraphing his intention clearly so she could respond without pressure. But when his blade came down in a controlled arc, Lyra's body reacted with speed and precision that shocked them both. She deflected his strike and immediately flowed into a counterattack that would have been devastating if she'd been using a real weapon with lethal intent. They both froze, staring at each other across the few inches that separated their blades. "How did you do that?" Kieran asked, his voice hushed with something between awe and concern. "I don't know." The words came out shaky with her own confusion. "It felt familiar, like I'd done it before, even though I know I haven't. Royal training, awakening along with her bloodline magic. Skills that had been suppressed beneath magical barriers for 15 years, now breaking free in response to the desperate need to survive what was coming. But she couldn't tell him that. Not yet. Not when she was still processing the truth Elder Thorne had revealed about her heritage. They continued training, and with each passing hour more abilities manifested. Enhanced reflexes that allowed her to anticipate attacks before they fully developed. Strength that seemed to multiply when she was pressed hard enough. Speed that made her movements blur when protective instincts took over. During breaks they talked. "The loneliness is the hardest part," Kieran said during one rest period, sitting against the courtyard wall with sweat dampening his dark hair. "Everyone wants something from you when you're king. Advice, favours, decisions that will benefit their interests. But no one sees you as just a person." Lyra understood that isolation, though from the opposite direction. She'd been invisible for so long that genuine human connection felt foreign, dangerous. "It's safer to be alone," she said quietly. "People can't hurt what they don't see." "But they can't love what they don't see either." His pale green eyes met hers across the small distance between them, and the mate bond hummed with shared understanding. "I used to dream about finding someone who would see me as Kieran instead of Alpha King, someone who would choose me for who I am rather than what I can give them." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither could fully voice. Because she did see him as Kieran had from the first moment their eyes met across the throne room, and he saw her as something more than a servant, more than the invisible girl who cleaned his palace and accepted cruelty as her due. But seeing each other, wanting each other, didn't change the political reality that made their bond impossible. "Tell me about your dreams," he said softly, "the ones you've buried so deep you've almost forgotten them." The request was dangerous, requiring her to acknowledge desires she'd never been allowed to voice. But in this secluded courtyard, with weapons in their hands and honesty in the air between them, the walls she built around her heart felt less solid. "I used to dream about mattering," she admitted, the words barely above a whisper, "about being seen as someone worth protecting instead of someone whose disappearance wouldn't be noticed, about having a place in the world that was mine by right rather than charity. You matter to me." The declaration was fierce, immediate, carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Your existence has turned my entire world upside down, made me question everything I thought I knew about duty and desire. How can you think you don't matter?" Before she could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the moment. They sprang apart, suddenly aware of how close they'd been sitting, how intimate their conversation had become. Royal advisers appeared at the courtyard entrance, their faces grim with the kind of news that couldn't wait for more convenient timing. "Your Majesty," Elder Thorne said, his voice carefully neutral despite the urgency in his eyes. "The wedding preparations require your immediate attention. Lady Seraphina's family has arrived, and there are complications with the ceremony arrangements." The real world crashed back over them like cold water. Wedding preparations, Lady Seraphina, the political marriage that would happen in less than 24 hours, regardless of mate bonds or personal desires, or the way Lyra's heart was breaking at the reminder of what could never be. Kieran rose reluctantly, his expression shuttering back into the careful mask of royal duty. But when he looked at her one last time, before leaving with his advisers, she saw the frustration and longing he couldn't entirely hide. "Tomorrow at dawn," he said quietly, the words meant only for her. "We'll continue your training." But they both knew that after tomorrow, after the wedding, that would bind him to another woman and seal their impossible bond behind walls of political necessity, there would be no more stolen moments in secluded courtyards, no more conversations about dreams and loneliness and the way they saw each other as more than their assigned roles in the world. After tomorrow, she would have to watch the man destined to be her mate pledge his life to someone else, while the mate bond burned between them like a constant reminder of everything they could never have. The training had awakened more than just her combat skills. It had awakened hope, and hope was the most dangerous thing she could allow herself to feel. Chapter 8. The Test of Loyalty. The wedding was announced with fanfare that could be heard throughout the kingdom. Church bells rang from dawn until dusk, their bronze voices carrying news that would reshape political alliances and secure the peace that had been negotiated through months of careful diplomacy. Lady Seraphina of the Moonstone Pack would wed Alpha King Kieran in exactly 1 week, uniting their territories in a bond that promised prosperity and protection for all their people. 1 week, 7 days to watch the man destined to be her mate pledge his life to another woman while the bond between them burned like an open wound. Lyra stood among the other servants in the great hall as the formal announcement was read, her hands clenched so tightly around her cleaning supplies that her knuckles had gone white. The mate bond pulsed with each word of the proclamation, sending waves of physical pain through her chest that made it difficult to breathe normally. Around her, the assembled court erupted in celebration. Nobles raised glasses of expensive wine in toasts to the happy couple. Musicians struck up festive melodies that would echo through the palace for days, and servants hurried to prepare for the influx of wedding guests who would soon arrive from across the kingdom. At the centre of it all, Kieran stood beside Lady Seraphina, with the kind of regal composure that came from a lifetime of public duty. But Lyra could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched almost imperceptibly when Seraphina's hand rested possessively on his arm. The mate bond carried his emotions to her despite the physical distance between them, frustration, duty, and a deep ache that matched her own. Seraphina was radiant in ivory silk that had probably been crafted by the kingdom's most skilled seamstresses, her golden hair arranged in elaborate braids threaded with pearls that caught the light every time she moved. She smiled and laughed at appropriate moments, played the part of the delighted bride-to-be with flawless precision. But when her cornflower blue eyes found Lyra's across the crowded hall, the mask slipped for just an instant. Long enough for Lyra to see the cold satisfaction there, the promise of pain that would come once the wedding was complete, and she no longer needed to maintain appearances. The celebration continued late into the evening, but Lyra escaped as soon as her duties allowed. She couldn't watch Kieran and Seraphina perform the charade of happy engagement for another moment without screaming or breaking something or doing something that would get her killed before the week was out. She was making her way through the servant corridors toward her quarters when the attack came. The first sign of danger was the sudden silence. No footsteps, no voices, no ambient sounds of palace life continuing around her. The second was the scent that didn't belong, something wild and hostile that made her newly awakened wolf press against mental barriers with desperate urgency. Enemy scouts in the palace, moving with the kind of stealth that spoke of military training and hostile intent. Lyra pressed herself against the stone wall, every enhanced sense straining to locate the threat. Her hearing, now supernaturally acute, picked up the soft whisper of leather against stone, the controlled breathing of trained fighters moving through territory they didn't belong in. They were testing the palace defences, probing for weaknesses that could be exploited during a larger assault. But they'd chosen their timing poorly. The wedding announcement had the entire palace on high alert, guards at every entrance, security protocols that made infiltration nearly impossible, unless someone had given them inside information about patrol schedules and blind spots. The thought had barely formed when the first scout rounded the corner, moving with predatory grace toward what he obviously thought was an empty corridor. He was dressed in dark leather that would blend with shadows, armed with weapons designed for quick, silent kills. His scent carried the territorial markings of a pack she didn't recognize. Northern territories, probably allied with enemies who saw the Moonstone Alliance as a threat to their own ambitions. Lyra held her breath, hoping he would pass without noticing her. She was unarmed, untrained in real combat despite the weapons practice with Kieran, completely unprepared to face a professional assassin with years of experience and no regard for the life of a servant girl who had seen too much. But her scent gave her away. Royal bloodline magic, no longer completely suppressed, carrying traces of power that made her wolf scent distinctive enough to catch attention. The scout's head snapped toward her hiding place, his eyes narrowing as he processed what he was detecting. The recognition in his expression was immediate and terrifying. This wasn't random infiltration. These scouts knew exactly who they were looking for. "Found her!" he called softly to companions Lyra couldn't see, but could now smell approaching from multiple directions. The bloodline anomaly. Seraphina was right about her location. Seraphina. The future queen had provided intelligence to enemy forces, given them detailed information about Lyra's identity and whereabouts. This wasn't just palace infiltration. It was targeted assassination, dressed up as military reconnaissance. The scout moved toward her with casual confidence, obviously expecting an easy kill. But the moment he raised his blade, something fundamental shifted inside Lyra's mind. The suppression barriers that had contained her power for 15 years didn't just crack, they shattered completely. Royal bloodline magic exploded through her system like liquid fire. Enhanced strength, supernatural speed, combat instincts honed through generations of warrior queens who had defended their territories with tooth and claw and steel. Her wolf burst free from mental cages that could no longer contain it, lending feral cunning to royal training that awakened in response to mortal threat. She moved faster than human eyes could track, ducking under his strike and driving her elbow into his solar plexus with enough force to lift him off his feet. The weapons training with Kieran had awakened muscle memory, But this was something deeper, ancestral knowledge written into her very bones. The scout's blade clattered to the stone floor as he doubled over, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. But there were others, emerging from the shadows with weapons drawn and expressions that promised no mercy for the servant girl who had interfered with their mission. Lyra grabbed the fallen blade, its weight familiar in her hands, despite days rather than years of training. Power sang through her muscles as she faced odds that should have been impossible, driven by protective instincts that demanded she survive long enough to warn Kieran of the betrayal that threatened his life. The fight that followed was brutal and brief. Royal bloodline magic multiplied her capabilities beyond anything she demonstrated during training sessions, lending supernatural grace to movements that flowed like water and struck like lightning. She killed 3 enemy scouts before they fully understood what they were facing, her blade finding gaps in armor with precision that spoke of ancestral expertise. By the time palace guards arrived, drawn by sounds of combat echoing through stone corridors, the threat had been neutralized. 4 enemy infiltrators lay dead, their weapons scattered across blood-splattered marble, while Lyra stood in the center of the carnage, with royal power crackling around her like visible heat. "Sound the alarm," she told the stunned guards, her voice carrying authority that made them respond immediately despite her servant's clothing. There are more of them. This was a coordinated attack, and someone inside the palace provided intelligence. The captain of the guard took in the scene, a servant girl who had single-handedly defeated trained assassins, displaying combat skills that rivaled those of elite warriors, and made the kind of quick decision that had earned him his position. "Escort her to the Alpha King," he commanded his men, immediately. The throne room was in chaos when they arrived. Reports of the attack had spread faster than wildfire, creating panic among courtiers who suddenly realized their safe palace might not be as secure as they'd believed. Kieran stood at the center of the storm, coordinating defensive responses with the kind of calm authority that reassured his people even in crisis. But when he saw Lyra enter the throne room, covered in enemy blood but uninjured, his careful composure cracked. She watched relief and terror war across his features as he processed how close he'd come to losing her. "You're hurt," he said, moving toward her with obvious intent to check for injuries, despite the watching court. "Not my blood," she replied, then louder for everyone to hear. The attack was coordinated. Someone provided them with intelligence about palace security and guard rotations. They knew exactly where to find me. The implication hung in the air like an accusation. Internal betrayal. A traitor in their midst who had endangered not just Lyra, but the entire palace by providing sensitive information to enemy forces. Lady Seraphina, who had been standing near the throne in a perfect display of concerned support for her intended, stepped forward with flawless composure. "Thank the goddess you're safe," she said, her voice pitched to carry exactly the right note of relief and gratitude. "When we heard there had been an attack, that servants were targeted, I feared the worst." But Lyra could smell the lie beneath the expensive perfume, could see the calculation behind cornflower blue eyes that were measuring how much truth had been discovered and how quickly damage control needed to be implemented. "They knew exactly where to find me," Lyra repeated, her gaze never leaving Seraphina's face. "They called me the bloodline anomaly and said you were right about my location." The accusation was direct, unmistakable, and delivered before an audience that included every important political figure in the kingdom. Seraphina's mask didn't slip, her royal training was too good for such obvious tells, but something cold and dangerous flickered behind her perfect features. "How curious," she said, with precisely the right amount of puzzled concern. "I wonder what they could have meant by such strange words." But Kieran was watching both women with the sharp intelligence that had made him an effective king, and Lyra could sense through their bond that he was beginning to put pieces together. The failed poisoning, the convenient timing of enemy infiltration, the way Seraphina always seemed to know more than she should about threats that targeted Lyra specifically. The mate bond carried his growing suspicion. his protective fury at the realization that someone had used his wedding preparations as cover for assassination attempts. But it also carried his impossible position. He couldn't accuse his intended bride of treason without proof that would hold up under political scrutiny. Not yet, but soon. Chapter 9. The Hunt and Revelation. The palace felt like a cage closing around her. In the 3 days since the enemy infiltration, Lyra had become the centre of unwanted attention from every direction. Guards followed her movements with barely concealed suspicion, courtiers whispered about the servant girl who had displayed impossible combat skills, and Lady Seraphina watched her with the patient hunger of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The wedding was tomorrow. In less than 24 hours, she would have to stand among the servants and watch Kieran pledge his eternal devotion to the woman who had tried to have them both killed. She couldn't do it. Couldn't stand there while the mate bond tore her apart. Couldn't pretend to smile and offer congratulations while her heart shattered into pieces that could never be put back together. Couldn't watch the man destined to be hers promise his life to someone else while political necessity made their connection impossible. The decision came to her in the pre-dawn darkness, crystallizing with the kind of clarity that comes from absolute desperation. She would leave. Tonight, while the palace slept and the guards were focused on wedding preparations. She would disappear into the forests that bordered the kingdom, find somewhere far enough away that the mate bond would eventually fade to a bearable ache instead of constant agony. It was the kindest thing she could do for both of them. Lyra packed her few belongings in silence, a spare dress, the pendant Elder Thorne had given her, what little money she'd managed to save from her servants' wages. Everything she owned fit into a small cloth bundle that could be carried easily and wouldn't slow her down when speed became essential. She left the palace through the servants' entrance, using skills learned during 15 years of moving invisibly through corridors where she didn't belong. The guards were focused on perimeter security, watching for external threats rather than a servant girl fleeing internal heartbreak. The forest embraced her like an old friend. Ancient trees rose around her like cathedral pillars, their branches filtering moonlight into silver patterns that danced across the forest floor. For the first time in days, she could breathe freely. Out here, away from political schemes and impossible mate bonds, she was just a woman walking through woods that felt more like home than any palace ever had. The attack came without warning. Crossbow bolts hissed past her head, embedding themselves in oak bark with soft thunks that spoke of professional accuracy, barely missed. Lyra dove behind a fallen log as more projectiles filled the air, her enhanced senses counting at least 6 attackers moving through the forest with military precision. These weren't random bandits looking for easy prey. They were hunters, armed with specialized equipment and moving with the kind of coordination that spoke of extensive planning. Someone had anticipated her flight, positioned forces to intercept her escape route, and equipped them with everything necessary to capture rather than kill. Capture. Not assassination this time, but something worse. The kind of interrogation that would extract every secret about her bloodline and abilities before disposing of her in ways that couldn't be traced back to noble hands. Lyra's wolf exploded to the surface, no longer constrained by suppression magic or social expectations. Royal bloodline power flooded her system as she shifted into a combat state that was part human strategy and part supernatural predator. Her vision sharpened until she could see heat signatures moving between the trees. Her hearing picked up whispered coordinates being relayed between team members, and her sense of smell identified individual scents that would allow her to track each attacker through the darkness. The first hunter died before he realized she'd moved from her hiding place. Enhanced speed carried her behind his position, while he was still focusing on the fallen log where she'd taken cover. Her blade, taken from one of the palace infiltrators and kept hidden ever since, found the gap between his armor plates with surgical precision. The second hunter managed to shout a warning before supernatural strength crushed his windpipe, But his cry had given away her new position, drawing the attention of remaining team members who adjusted their formation to account for capabilities they hadn't expected from a fleeing servant girl. Professional soldiers, well-trained, properly equipped, coordinated in their assault. Under normal circumstances, they would have overwhelmed a single target within minutes. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Lyra was no longer the terrified servant they'd been hired to capture. Royal bloodline magic sang in her veins as she moved through the forest like a force of nature. Ancient training awakened muscle memory that turned her into something between warrior and wild beast, deadly efficient in ways that spoke of generations of queens who had defended their territories with personal violence when necessary. She killed 4 more hunters before the survivors retreated into darkness, leaving their dead scattered among the trees like offerings to whatever supernatural force they'd encountered. But in searching their bodies for identification, Lyra found something that made her blood freeze with understanding. Orders, written in familiar handwriting on expensive paper that carried the subtle perfume of jasmine and roses. Capture alive for questioning regarding bloodline origins. Extract all information about magical suppression and royal connections. Eliminate permanently once intelligence gathering is complete. Payment upon delivery of signed confession detailing treason against the crown. Lady Seraphina's elegant script, as distinctive as her beauty and twice as deadly. But more damning than the assassination orders was what she found in the lead hunter's pack. Documents that proved the scope of the conspiracy Lyra had stumbled into. Letters between Seraphina and Northern pack leaders, promising them territorial concessions in exchange for destabilizing the Alpha King's rule. Detailed plans for using the wedding ceremony as cover for a larger assault that would eliminate key royal supporters and install a more malleable puppet government. Financial records showing payments to assassins, bribes to palace staff, and funding for the enemy infiltrations that had been testing palace defences for months. The marriage wasn't about alliance or political necessity. It was about conquest, dressed up in silk and ceremony to hide the knife aimed at the kingdom's heart. Seraphina wasn't just a rival for Kieran's affections. She was an enemy agent whose entire courtship had been designed to position her for a coup that would destroy everything he'd worked to build. Lyra stared at the evidence in her hands, understanding blooming with the kind of terrible clarity that changes everything. She couldn't flee now, couldn't disappear into the forest while the man destined to be her mate walked unknowingly into a trap that would cost him his crown and probably his life. The mate bond, which had been a source of constant pain, suddenly became a lifeline. Through their connection, she could sense Kieran's location back at the palace, could feel his emotional state as he prepared for a wedding that would destroy him in ways he couldn't imagine. But she could also sense something else through the bond, growing doubt about his intended bride, suspicion that had been building since the assassination attempts began, protective instincts that were starting to question whether political alliance was worth the cost being demanded. He was beginning to understand the truth, not the full extent of Seraphina's betrayal, but enough to make him question everything he'd accepted about duty and sacrifice and the price of keeping his people safe. Lyra gathered the incriminating documents and turned back toward the palace. Running away had been the act of a broken servant girl who accepted that she could never have what she wanted most. But returning with evidence of treason, that was the act of a queen protecting her mate and her kingdom from enemies who threatened everything they held dear. The suppression magic was completely gone now, burned away by crisis and supernatural awakening. Royal bloodline power flowed through her like liquid fire, awakening abilities she was only beginning to understand. Enhanced senses that could detect lies and hidden intentions, combat skills that made her dangerous to trained soldiers, and something deeper, more profound, the kind of authority that came from bloodline magic older than the kingdom itself. She was no longer the invisible servant girl who cleaned floors and accepted cruelty as natural. She was the last heir of the Silver Moon bloodline, destined mate of the Alpha King, and the only person who could stop the coup that would destroy everything they both loved. The wedding was still hours away, time enough to return to the palace, present evidence that would expose Seraphina's treachery and prevent the ceremony that would bind Kieran to an enemy who planned to destroy him. Time enough to save the kingdom and claim the destiny that had been hidden from her for so long. Time enough to stop running from who she was meant to be.